Hey everyone, and welcome to video number 2 for chapter 23. And for this video, we're going to be talking about European trade and conflict in Asia. The European powers, they very rarely engage in outright conquest of Asian territories during this time period. They didn't really have the strength to go up against the established powers like China. What they were able to do, though, was establish fortified trading posts that gave them control over local trade and local populations. These trade empires occasionally led to military conflicts, both with locals and also eventually among competing European states. So the first thing we're going to talk about are trade empires. Now remember, a trade empire is different from an outright empire where you have military and governmental control. Trade empires are really just about controlling trade that comes in or out of certain regions. And we'll be focusing on the first European trade empire, which was the Portuguese. There we go. These were Portuguese trading posts. Portugal, as I said, was the first to establish a permanent European presence in India and Southeast Asia when Da Gama established one in Calicut in 1498. And these trading posts, they stretched from West Africa all the way to Japan. Now, some of these would be outright colonies like Brazil. We're not really talking about that just yet. And even Angola and Mozambique would be colonies up until the 20th century. But you're really focusing on all these smaller trading posts through the Indian Ocean basin, Southeast Asia, and as I said, Japan, even Nagasaki. That was a trading post from 1571 to 1638. So their economic power stretched all along, the coast of Africa, throughout the Indian Ocean basin, and even into the Pacific as well. They could often be brutal in their enforcement of power, such as with Alphonse de Albuquerque. Their small size Portugal's small size prevented it from holding on to power for that long, and eventually lost control of trade routes to England and the Netherlands. England and the Netherlands, they formed what's called trading companies. They were joint stock trading companies. These were supported by the government, but they were privately owned and funded. For the Dutch, you had the VOC, and for England, you had the English East India Company, which would later become the British East India Company in the 1700s. Charters that formed these companies granted them rights to build trading posts that really returned huge amount of financial profits. So the governments, the Dutch and English governments, were more than happy to let these trading companies kind of do what they wanted. The English and later the British East India Company in particular had become very, very powerful in India. Now, you did have some outright European conquest in Asia, not nearly as much as you saw in the Americas, but there was some Asian territories that were claimed, such as the Philippines. Now, the Philippines are a relatively small archipelago country in Southeast Asia, kind of, in the South China Sea. Sorry, just listen to something in the background. Spanish ships landed there in 1565, and Spain claimed it and renamed it for their king, King Philip II, hence the name, the Philippines. There really was not much in the way of organized resistance. As a segmented country, as an archipelago, they didn't really have a unified government. The biggest impact that the Spanish had on Filipino society was religion. Roman Catholicism became the dominant religion in the Philippines and still is to this day, and also with trade. Asian trade turned the city of Manila, which is the capital city of the Philippines today, into a multinational trade hub. You look at the trade routes as they go from Manila down to, and kind of the Spanish colonies in the Americas were like the middleman in between here. As ships would go across the Pacific, they'd land in Mexico, and then goods would be shipped across the narrowest parts of Mexico, then through the Caribbean and onwards into European markets in Spain. It was a pretty extensive and vast trading network. So Spain controlled the Philippines. The Dutch, though, they controlled Java. Now, they wanted to control the spice trade in Indonesia. They didn't have the numbers to conquer the entire area of what today is Indonesia. Right? You look at Indonesia as this area in the box around here, even a little bit outside of it. It's a fairly large archipelago nation today. They didn't have to control the whole area because it was so segmented. They took advantage of the geography of it, and they just dominated the island of Java right here. And you notice that it's got a narrow strait, and so as ships, if they wanted to come through all these areas for picking up goods, you kind of have to go through this strait in order to continue on into the Indian Ocean. So controlling Java meant that they could control all the trade that came in and out of that. So this reaped huge financial benefits for Dutch merchants. All right, now Russia. Russia was doing things a little bit different. Russia wasn't really that interested in maritime conquest. They were looking to expand eastward across their own land, or would eventually become their land. Now, Mongol rule in Central Asia started to fall apart in the 16th century. You see on the map here as the Russian rulers started to expand outwards. The purple was the Muscovy of Moscow. About the time of Ivan the Great in 1462, and then by the green, where you got the time of his grandson and great-grandson, Fyodor in 1598, you can see how it's starting to expand eastward. And it's starting to expand into this region here, Siberia. Now, Siberia is big, right? You look at this whole green region is the region of Siberia. It's more than twice the size of the rest of Russia, even though most of Russia's population lives in this red area today. And the reason being is that Siberia is largely frozen throughout its long winter, so it doesn't yield a whole lot in the way of agriculture, but fur trade was a lucrative moneymaker. Siberia is also a multi-ethnic region. It's got a lot of different languages and cultures. As Russia expanded into Siberia, they were primarily looking to trade for fur. As they would encounter the indigenous groups of Siberia, they would try different ways to coerce them into helping them with the fur trade. Sometimes, trading with them, directly with them, for guns and textiles and manufactured goods. Other times violently forcing them to help them. Violence and disease brought by the Russians had a massive depopulation effect on the Siberian people. It's very similar to what you saw with European expansion among the Native Americans. Eventually, these trading posts led to further Russian expansion into Siberia. Right, you look at the map here, Russian territory in 1462, like we looked at the map before, and then really kind of the light green up till 1598. But you look from the next century, from 1599 to 1689, how they quickly really looked to incorporate all of this territory. They kept moving westward, and this also changed the demographics of Siberia. By the 17th century, the Russian population was double that of the indigenous Siberians. And then a lot of it because of mining prospects that they found out here in eastern Siberia. It further led to Russian expansion, and it increased the Russian population even more so by the 1800s. Then by the time of the Soviet Union, obviously they controlled all of this. Now, eventually this is going to lead into conflict. So what we've discussed so far, European expansion has led to some conflict over trade routes or with indigenous peoples, but competition for trade routes and colonies was eventually going to lead to direct conflict. When I say conflict, obviously I mean war between European nations. These conflicts, they were initially started out as commercial rivalries. This was found like in the control for the spice trade in Southeast Asia. That changed hands first from Portugal to the Dutch VOC to the English East India Trading Company. And then by the 18th century, India had become the much more valuable commodity because of its cotton and tea. That had started to replace spice as being the big resources to ship out of that area. France would eventually become involved in this when they captured the English trading post of Madras. Now, these rivalries, they carried over into competition for control of the Americas as well. All of these commercial rivalries, they culminated in this war called the 7 Years' War. Now, we learn about the 7 Years' War in U.S. history as the French and Indian War, but it was actually much more of a global conflict. Now, you look in the European theater, your main areas of fighting were in and around here in the Holy Roman Empire, the Allies, Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, Saxony, Spain. They look like they would have the advantage in terms of numbers, but Great Britain and Prussia had a military and technology advantage. So they actually were doing okay with themselves. Portugal was involved in this as well. So you had a fair amount of fighting in Europe. You had fighting in India. Here, Madras, that was the one I said that the French captured from England. This was primarily just fought between English and French forces for control of Indian trading posts. And then the one, that, as I mentioned before, we kind of think of as the French and Indian War in North America and also in the Caribbean, right? Because you have the Spanish controlling the Caribbean, but then you also have French and British interests looking for control in the Caribbean also. So The outcome of this war was not a ton of change going on in Europe, but the biggest outcome was that Britain emerged as kind of the top superpower. They didn't get too involved in the European theater. They let Prussia handle most of the fighting. It happened, most of it in Prussia's backyard anyway. But they maintained control in India, so they pretty much drove France out of there, and they would maintain control in India up until after World War II. And they clearly became the dominant power in North America. All right, you look at the pre-war boundaries in 1754, where Britain basically only controlled the American coastline. Florida was controlled by Spain, obviously all of this, and then the rest of all of this was controlled by France. By 1763, the British basically controlled everything up until the Mississippi River, including all of Canada. Now, you still had French populations here. That's why in places like Quebec, they speak French to this day. But this was all controlled by Canada, and it's why Canada is still a commonwealth of Britain even to this day. So they would clearly become the dominant power when it comes to Atlantic trade, and they would use its naval power to control Atlantic trade for the next 200 years. Okay, so that wraps up talking about conflict, and in the next video we will talk about global exchanges such as the Columbian Exchange.